Well, thank you, Warren. That's an inspiring address and full of hope and optimism for the future. So really appreciate that. Thank you, Dennis, for the kind introduction. I thought it was a little bit over the top, frankly, but I have to admit it was exactly the same as the one I emailed you last week. So thank you very much for getting that right. This is actually the second time Dennis has got me doing an address to Cricket Ireland. And somebody told me the other day that Dennis always invites you to address Cricket Ireland twice. First, when your career is on the way up, and secondly, when your career is on the way down. So Dennis, it's great to be back. Very happy to be here today. So what we're going to do is, talk a little bit about why networking is so important and how do you network when you can't network? It sounds a little bizarre to be talking about networking in the current climate. And then I'm going to look at 5 very exciting opportunities that I think are opening up for Cricket Ireland and by definition, Cricket Ireland sponsors. Which is all about a certain globalization, certain things that are going on. But I think all of us have to ask ourselves right now in the middle of this pandemic, in this lockdown, 2 pretty fundamental questions. And the first question is, what do I need to do now to prepare myself, to prepare my organization for a very different world in the year 2021? And secondly, a kind of a brutal, harsh question we have to ask ourselves, is my network good enough for where I want to be in the next while? And if it isn't, what action do I need to take? I've always felt the future was like a 3-legged stool. You forecast, you plan, you execute. But we live at a time where we don't know today what tomorrow will bring, where the circumstances we're living and working in are literally changing by the hour, by the day. I'm sure there's going to be more news today about more changes. And so, if we can't kind of plan and execute, and what can we do? Well, I think the important thing is not to hunker down during this time, but actually to get ready. To get ready because, as Abraham Lincoln famously once said, this too shall pass. This thing will pass at some stage. And now is the time to prepare and get ready. There's an old Irish expression that says, when business is down, that's when you paint the shop. I've always liked that line. So now is the time to get ready. Now, as Dennis suggested, my background mostly involved working overseas. I was with IDA Ireland and the Enterprise Ireland for about nearly 8 years in Sydney in Australia. And then I moved to the US and worked with the Ireland Funds, as Dennis explained. I ended up working in 6 countries. I ended up going to countries where I didn't know anybody. I didn't have a single connection. And I realized that to survive and thrive, I needed to build a strong and diverse network. I understood that was the glue that kind of made everything happen. And I wasn't great at networking when I said, I never did any networking at school or college or even early in my career. But then I began to appreciate, particularly going to places where I knew nobody, that this was really critically important. And I learned some lessons from this. I learned, first of all, that we all have organic networks. And that comes about from our family, from our broader relations, from our school, from our college, from our educational connections, from our sports that we play, from our hobbies, our church, or whatever it is. It's kind of an organic, it's kind of there. But as you progress through life, you actually have to become more intentional. So you actually have to plan this stuff and have a bit of a strategy about networking. Most people don't have a networking strategy. Most companies don't have a networking strategy. But actually, everybody agrees it's critically important. And also, you have to take action. If nothing happens, then quick as a flash, nothing happens. And so you need to do something. You need to make a plan. And one of the things I learned was the power of hanging around good networkers. There's no cliche that says, we are the average of the people we hang around with. Hang around with pessimistic people, guess what you become. Hang around with optimistic people, guess what you become. Hang around with good networks. And some of this stuff kind of rubs off. I also have to admit that I'm a founder member of an organization called CASE. And CASE stands for Copy and Steal Everything. Figure out who's doing these things well and what bits and pieces that you can pick from these people that would work for you or for your organization. So as everybody mentioned, the elephant in the room is, of course, COVID-19, which is like a tornado with a really long tail. That's not to say pre-COVID-19, we were in a period of significant change. They called it VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Technology robotics, globalization, AI were disrupting entire industries, disrupting whole layers and sectors of industry. So change was happening dramatically. You know, it was Lenin, the Russian leader, said that sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and then weeks pass and decades happen. I think we've gone through a period of that, where things like, you know, the extent to which we're using the Zooms, etc., have accelerated dramatically. You know, somebody called me the other day because I do this so much, a baby Zoomer, which I thought was quite funny. And somebody else called me a Zimmer Zoomer, which I didn't like at all. But we're now using this technology, and we're getting so at ease with this stuff. It happened, you know, so quickly over the last few months. But if I had said to you, just imagine, if I had said to you 10 years ago, I'm in my Uber on my iPhone, booking an Airbnb in Dublin, the only single word in that sentence you would have understood would have been the word Dublin, because those three other things didn't exist. So the question today is, what are the things 10 years from now? We just have no idea about now, but they'll be in common parlance in 10 years. You know, the CEO of Mercedes-Benz said back in January, he said, change is happening now faster than ever before and never will be as slow again. And in many ways, despite the awfulness of this COVID crisis, we've had it pretty good for pretty long. Somebody put it to me the other day, imagine you were born in the year 1900. When you were 14, there was a world war that killed 22 million people. When you were 18, there was a global pandemic. Funny that. When you were 29, the entire world economy collapsed. When you were 39, there was another world war that 62 million people died in. So, you know, some of the messages that we're in now is that, you know, success in the past is no guarantee of success in the future. The strategies that got us here won't get us there. You know, Peter Drucker, the American management consultant, said to create the future, you have to be the enemy of today. Or as Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives. It's not even the most intelligent. It's those most able to handle change. And so now we've had to move since the beginning of the year, earlier in the year, to remote working. And we've had to engage in social distancing. I actually think social distancing is possibly the wrong words to use. It should actually be physical distancing, but social connecting. So we've had to change the way we connect. We can't have lunches, dinners, teas. We can't have coffees. We can't have drinks after work. There's no more serendipitous bumping into people. We're missing all of that. And I personally have to say, I'm struggling with this. I'm missing all of that kind of stuff. But yet I took the option, as many people had the option to do, which was to pivot and become active online. And what I discovered in this process, I don't think it's anywhere as good as the old traditional connecting, but actually it's opened up some interesting new opportunities, which all of us can take advantage of. And I was thinking about what are the pluses of virtual connecting? And I think there's probably 5 or 6 pluses. Firstly, you're not restricted geographically. You can connect with anybody, anywhere in the world at any time, and it's mostly for free. That's phenomenal. Because now we live in a world where it's more important what you do than where you are. In the old days, your geography dictated your identity. But now we say geography is history. You know, 10,000 people who work for Google in Ireland, most of them now have all gone home all around the world. And they're still active and still engaged. So technology has opened up some fascinating possibilities here. And I think there's a real cricket dimension to that I'll come back to. I think a second plus of virtual connecting is we don't have to waste time and energy and money and carbon footprint and grooming time by traveling all over the place, traveling all over the world to have meetings and nothing actually ever comes out of that meeting. The other thing that's fascinating about this period is everybody is available. I keep getting calls from people saying, are you around next week? Of course I'm around next week. I can't go anywhere. So I'm available. I'm around. I can talk to anybody, anytime, anywhere. I can follow up immediately with people as well. And there are more people are spending more time online now than ever before in history. And not only that, you can find out enormous amounts of information about everybody, nearly everybody. 700 million people have told one company their entire educational details, their work experience, their interests and hobbies and who they know. And that company is called LinkedIn. So now you can find out enormously about people. You know where they are. You know that they're available. You can connect with them very cheaply. I think it's fascinating. And when we do go back, I don't think we will go back. When we go forward to a new form of working next year, when this thing begins to pass, we will have not only our traditional networks of people, but we'll have this entirely new tribe of people, which you've had the opportunity to develop. So I mentioned just fleeting there that the Spanish flu, 100 years ago, we had this thing, well, a bit more than 100, in 1918, there was an extraordinary pandemic called the Spanish flu. Interestingly enough, poor old Spain got labeled being called the Spanish flu. The only reason it's called the Spanish flu is because Spain, being a neutral country in the First World War, actually admitted that they had this virus. The other major powers in Europe had the virus, but they didn't tell anybody because they didn't want the enemy to know that they had this issue. So it became known as the Spanish flu. It affected 500 million people in the world. 1 in 3 people caught the Spanish flu virus in the world. 50 million people died, much more than in the First World War. In Ireland, 800,000 people caught this virus and 23,000 people died. But here's what's interesting. The Spanish flu was followed by an enormous period of creativity, growth, and innovation. In essence, there was like an economic renaissance followed the Spanish flu. It led to what you remember, the roaring 20s. Unemployment went down to about 4%. And the drivers were technology. The big driver was the advent of electricity throughout the entire, in this case, throughout the entire United States. And also the mass production of cars. So the Ford and Henry Ford Motor Company produced millions of cars, which meant that they had to build hundreds of thousands of roads and restaurants and highways and sports events. And everybody then started using the radio. So the radio was the big connector. Movies flourished and boomed. But what was interesting in this period was that it was an incredible period of booming in sport. The greatest period in sport in American history was actually in the 20s. The war was over. People wanted to forget the fighting. They wanted to enjoy themselves. They wanted escapism. Massive stadia with holding over 100,000 people in. Sports stadia were built all over the country. Baseball, college football, boxing became massive. Everybody knew about Babe Ruth and Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey, or in golf, you had Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen and Gene Sarazen, these great sorts of names. Spectator sport actually saw America through the Great Depression. Now, I think there's going to be a similar surge after this pandemic. It's going to be driven by technology. I suspect broadband, universal global broadband. And I think that's going to be a phenomenon. And then on the economic side, perhaps it could be the global adoption of the green economy. I suspect Biden will introduce a massive infrastructure bill in the United States who need to completely, repair their aging highways and bridges, etc. So I think that that's the time, this is the period now to get ready for this kind of surge. So networking is more important now than ever because, frankly, companies are going to reconfigure their staff structures, which means that individuals are going to have to reconsider their career options. And that means they're going to need to have their networks in place. So we're facing turbulence and disruption, but we're also facing, I think, terrific opportunity. This is a period where networking is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. It's essentially about 3 things. It's moving your mindset from being transaction-driven to being relationship-driven. It's about altering your behavior, and we all know that's the hardest thing in the world. We're coming up to Christmas and New Year's Eve. We'll make these resolutions, which will last about 10 or 12 days. And it's also about learning some new skills. But the truth is that one conversation, one introduction can change your life. But they don't happen lying in bed or sitting at your desk. They happen when you're in motion. They happen when you're out and about. They happen when you do things. They happen when you put your talents on display. It happens when you get opportunity to speak or write. It happens in an online network, an online identity. So what is networking? Well, networking is We all agree, long-term hearts and minds, sustainable relationships. We kind of know that. Everybody buys into that. But not everybody buys into what I think the real definition of networking is. Networking is all about giving, not getting. Most people think, I need to network because I want something. I want a job, or I want a sale, or I want a client. And here am I saying, actually, it's not about that at all. It's not even about you. Networking is about the other person. Networking is thinking about, what can I give to an individual on a consistent basis because I know that will come back from the network. So why is it important? Well, frankly, in life, you can't go it alone. You know, we've sometimes bought into this myth of individualism, that life is all about the rugged individual taking on the world. It's all about sort of the Lone Ranger, the Marlboro Man. And I'm sure Gaby and Andy will tell you, success is all about teamwork. It's all about collaborating, cooperating. Opportunities don't float around on clouds. They're attached to people. If you're looking for an opportunity, you're really looking for a person. But here's why I'm particularly interested in networking. All the research shows that networking can be helpful. It's helpful. We know how helpful it can be for obviously getting business and finding clients and attracting staff and finding investors, lots of good stuff. But research also shows something else. People who have strong and diverse networks live longer, are stronger mentally and physically, earn more money, and are happier. I like all of the above. And in fact, there's another one which I think is so important right now in the world we're living in today. Networking is the great antidote to one of the great crises of our time, which is actually loneliness. But your network is the way you escape your silo. We're also busy being busy. We need to find a way to connect with people doing different things in different places, and that you do through your network. There is this concept called homophily, and homophily is the tendency we all have to hang around with people who are just like us. You know, we're born into families with people like us. We go to school, we play sport, we get educated, we go on holidays with people just like us. We marry people just like us, and we produce more people just like us. But that's not what the world out there is. So I grew up in Dublin, and when I grew up, the city was essentially male, pale, and stale. This was not a very international, cosmopolitan city like it is today. Think of the statistics. 14% of the United States were not born in the United States. In Ireland, it's 17%. In Dublin, it's 25%. But of the working age population of Dublin, it's 33%. So 33% of the people walking around in this city were not even born in this country. That's a hugely different set of circumstances to live in. But here's my question. Does your network, as an individual, as an organization, reflect the diversity of the economy you work in, society you live in? And for most people, the answer is no. And all the research shows that if that's the case, you underperform as a person, as an organization. Your network is the way you'll get your next job. 80% of good jobs are not advertised. You'll get your next job through your network. And companies want to hire and wire. Companies want to hire people and wire into their network. So when you're being interviewed for a job, they want to know about your background, your experience, your education, who you've worked for, but they want to know something else. They want to know who you know. Because you see, we live in a world where it's not what you know, it's not even who you know, it's who knows you. But you won't build a strong and diverse network unless you get comfortable doing something most of us feel uncomfortable with, me included. I particularly dislike this bit, which is talking to strangers. You've got to be comfortable talking to strangers. You've got to be able to walk into a room and go places where you know nobody. And we all kind of find that difficult. We call it stranger danger. In fact, when you think about it, what do we teach our kids from a very young age? We say, don't talk to strangers. And yet, statistically, our children are at more danger from friends and family than they are from strangers. But your network is a source of network intelligence. And companies now realize that. The people who work for them have a source of information about what's going on in business and society and sectors and segments. There's an old cliche that says there's more smart people outside your organization than inside your organization. So you need to use your network to find out that information. And frankly, the whole career structure has changed and gone dramatically. So my dad left school at 14, joined a company, and left that company age 77, just a quick 63 years in one company. In the old days, companies outlived individuals, but now individuals outlive companies. Companies last on average 20 years. People in C-suite positions last on average 7 years. The old escalator model of a career where you join, work, progress, work your way up to the clock in the corner and the corner office, that's all gone. So you're going to need your network more than ever before. Your network is your career advancer. But there's some real problems with networking. Frankly, most people hate it. They just hate the concept of it. And that's awful. You know, people differentiate between the word network, the noun, which they think, yeah, that's okay. Having a good network sounds good. And the verb, networking, which sounds sleazy, insincere, inauthentic, even a little bit dirty. Networking, how awful. Networking is not taught at school or college. Schools and colleges teach you lots of information, lots of knowledge, but not great at teaching you skills. Information and knowledge will change very quickly. Those skills will stay with you for life. Organizations, companies don't have strategies for networking. People in the company say, it's not my job. I wasn't hired to network. I was hired to do something else. It's not a KPI. It's not a key performance indicator. It doesn't show up in the recruitment process. We tend to mix up networking and sociability. We think the most sociable person is the best networker. Actually, and this is fascinating, I think, introverts can be better at networking than extroverts. Why is that? Because they do it with decency, authenticity, integrity. They ask questions and they listen. The number one skill in networking is to be a great listener. And so many people don't realize that as their career progresses, the technical skills they needed to get their job in the first instance become less important and relationships become more important. And they fail to migrate across and make that distinction. And they don't ask themselves that brutal question, is my network good enough? So some real issues and problems with networking. It's something that's really important, but it's not urgent. And of course, we live our lives all the time doing urgent things. I was lucky enough in the countries I worked in to work for people who are really good at networking. And so I observed them and I watched them and I realized that in these different countries, great networkers had a series of characteristics in common. They worked hard at it. They were humble. They didn't brag about it. They didn't keep score. They didn't say, hey, Warren, I did you a favor 6 months ago. You owe me one. They don't think like that. They think like farmers who plants a seed and waters and nurtures and knows that there will be a harvest. They realize their network is an organic thing. If you don't look after it, it will wither and die like all organic things. They know that they need to be curious. Great networkers ask really good questions. They know there's two types of information in the world. There's formal information, which you can Google it or you can read reports. That information is available to everybody. Information available to everybody. You can't compete on that. And there's informal information, nudges, tips, winks, suggestions, ideas. That comes from your network. So they believe in referrals, the power of being referred to somebody. They believe in always replacing cold calls, as I say, with hot coffees. They know that the way to people they don't know is through people they do know. They understand that your weak connections can often be more important than your strong connections. Because of that homophily concept, we tend to have strong connection with people just like us. So not only do we know them, we know their views and opinions, we know their friends' views and opinions. But weak connections, they bridge you into other different types of people. That becomes important. Great networkers are high tech. They understand the incredible power of technology, but they're also high touch. And they realize that in a world where we're veering very much down the technology road, that actually having that warmth and that sense of empathy with people is very important. So they do that and they network with decency and authenticity, etc. So one of the exercises we have to do in answering that question, is my network good enough? We actually have to audit our network. We actually have to look at our network, print it off. And when you print off your network and look at it, you discover three things. Firstly, you need to clean up your network, get rid of redundant entries. I mean, I had takeaways in Boston or dry cleaners in Sydney. I don't need them. Secondly, you'll realize you've got some gaps in your network. There's some areas you know nobody. So you can actually begin to take some action to fill those gaps. And thirdly, you'll discover you had some dormant connections. You had some great connections in the past and you've just let them slip. Nothing happened. You went this way, they went that way. You know, you didn't have a row or anything. Life got in the way. And I've been doing this during lockdown, every week, ringing somebody I used to know really well, haven't spoken to for some years. I've had some wonderful connections and conversations. But you also need to segment your network because not everybody on your network's the same. So you divide into different categories. And I think that it's like a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have a contact. That's a name on your network. And for the life of you, you can't remember who they were. You must have met them somewhere at a conference or at a bar or a match and you swapped a business card. Pretty damn weak. But moving up, the next level is a connection. You know them, they know you. You're not doing anything together, but there's an element of familiarity. If you call them, they'd know who you were and vice versa. That's much better. And then moving up again, the next level is a relationship. That's terrific. You know each other. You're doing business with each other. You like each other and you trust each other. In a world where trust is at its lowest level in recorded history, that's important too. And then at the very top of the pyramid, I call it a friend. And I don't have many in this category. I have people I work with, are friends, I have friends that are friends. But my definition of this category is somebody you could call on their cell phone on a Sunday afternoon. And that's not many people that I would do that to. So in a way, in every meeting and every opportunity, there's three great questions you can always ask. Always have these questions ready. The first question is, what can I do for you? Because most people think, I need a network for me. But actually turning that on its head is a very generous thing to do. Second question is, if you were me, what would you do? So what you're doing is you're paying respect and deference to somebody's wisdom, and you're asking them, you know, what do you think? What would you do for me? What do you advise me to do? You know, so that's interesting because you're asking for advice, which is often free, and you're paying respect and you're listening to what somebody has to say. And then the third question, which is in many ways the gold dust question in networking, is who do you know who lives in Bristol, works in aircraft leasing, is involved with reinsurance, whatever the category is. And so what you're really saying is, do we know each other well enough? Are you willing to put your reputation on the line and make an introduction for me? And that is, if you like, the gold dust question. So I said I was going to mention 5 things that I think are opening up for Cricket Ireland, and by definition, Cricket Ireland sponsors. I mean, as Warren said earlier, it's an extraordinary global sport, an amazing 2.5 million fans, the #2 sport in the world, over 100 countries now involved in cricket. Huge strides been made in Ireland over the last decade, and hats off to Warren, you and all your colleagues for that. But here's the first thing I was reflecting on. We're living in a time now when hundreds of millions of people are working from home. And as we exit gradually, gingerly over the next 6, 12, 18 months, whatever it is, more and more people will be returning to work. But I'm not sure that they'll all be returning to work the way it was before. I suspect we'll end up in a kind of a hybrid sort of relationship with work. In other words, people might spend 2 days or 3 days a week at home and a couple of days in the office or in a regional hub or whatever. But here's what's interesting. You know, they're going to be at home. They're not going to be under surveillance of a boss or colleagues. They're not going to be in an open plan office. They're going to be able to watch and listen to whatever they want. And that could be cricket. So I think that's fascinating, that literally hundreds of millions of people around the world, because you see, cricket is a long game, and even the short form of cricket is quite long. So I think that's really interesting. And maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here, but I haven't heard anybody talk about this opportunity for cricket. I think that this post-COVID surge, there'll be such a pent-up demand for technology. There's pent-up capital. I think when that gets applied, we're going to see surges in things like broadband. But I also think we're sitting on something else, and particularly from Ireland's point of view. I think we're sitting on an underdeveloped, to an extent, an underexploited resource, which is the Irish diaspora. And I was involved in this for a long time, and it was very interesting. So 10 million people left this country in history. It's a lot of people. More people per head left this country than any other country in the history of the world. And that's the bad news. The good news is that we now have a diaspora of 70 million people around the world. And I think that offers up enormous possibilities. Now, I worked in this area for a long time, and I worked for a guy called Tony O'Reilly. You're all probably too young to remember him, but he was really a legendary Irish sports guy. He was played for the Irish rugby team first when he was 18, played for the Lions when he was 19, toured South Africa, toured New Zealand, became an absolute legend, scored 39 tries for the Lions. Nobody's ever done anything close to that. Went on to have a stellar career in business, running the H.J. Heinz Food Company, Waterford Crystal, independent newspapers, and all that kind of stuff. He was an extraordinary individual. But here's something I noticed about him, which again, I don't think I've ever heard anybody else say. Tony never invested in any country in the world where he hadn't played international rugby. He used his sports connections to pursue his career around the world. So in New Zealand, you know, the head of his company was Wilson Winnery, captain of the All Blacks. You know, in Australia there were rugby players. In South Africa, and these are cricket countries, big time cricket countries. In South Africa, I mean, all his sort of executives seem to be ex-Springboks. And I noticed how he leveraged off that network globally. And so he had an idea with another wonderful sports guy called Dan Rooney. Dan Rooney owned the Pittsburgh Steelers in the United States. Dan and Tony came together and said, could we set up a network in the United States that would engage philanthropically and support projects in Ireland, some of them sporting, but many of them cultural, many of them educational, many of them community development, and many of them in Northern Ireland where we had the troubles, as they say. Now, this was an unproven idea, this resource for Ireland. And so we came together and we had a dinner, a big black tie fundraising dinner in New York, the great and the good, that we came to that dinner. The dinner was so unsuccessful. The only reason we had a second dinner a year later was to pay for the first dinner we had those years ago. But that's $700 million ago. What started at zero or minus actually went on to become an extraordinary global network of the Irish diaspora. And it was just an amazing journey to be on. It taught me one lesson, is that nobody ever started a large organization. When you think about it, the most successful company in the world today started when a 21-year-old son of a Syrian migrant in a garage with his 27-year-old mate, Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs put together the first computer for Apple. It just started in a shed. You know, Hewlett and Packard started in a garage. Disney started in an outhouse. Starbucks and Amazon started in people's front rooms. Two kids from Limerick, you know, have started a computer company over in the West Coast of the United States that's worth billions of dollars. And it's in the non-profit space. Men's Sheds was an idea from Australia that came to Ireland, set up one, and there's now 500 of them. And so this is extraordinary. So now what we have throughout the world, because of technology now, we can now connect with these people like never before. Because the big question, and even in my days, we didn't have the technology to answer the question about the Irish diaspora, which is who are they, where are they, and what are they doing? But now we can. And now, as we say, lost actors can become national assets. So now it's this idea of how do you use the diaspora? So when I was working with the IDA, we used to have this approach of using our diaspora to open doors, using our diaspora to give us information and intelligence of the marketplace. We used to call them tipping agents. These were people who were able to nudge a deal in our direction. Because we were believers in this theory of marginal gains, that the difference between success and failure, certainly if you're working for the IDA, was extraordinary. If you won an inward investment deal for Ireland, fantastic. If you came second, you got nothing. Zero, zilch, nada. And very often the difference between first and second was minuscule, was wafer thin, was tiny. And so Andy, and you know this, and Gaby, you know this from sport. People can win after 4 rounds in the Masters by 1 shot. We all watched the England win with Owen Morgan last year. That last over could have gone either way. So many times it's wafer thin. So you need every single thing that you can get And that's why your network is so important. I've always been fascinated by an English guy, I'm sure, Warren, you know of David Brailsford. David Brailsford took over British cycling. For 100 years, British cycling won nothing. In the Atlanta Olympics, I think they won 1 bronze. But then when it came to the London Olympics, they won 8 gold, 6 silver, 6 bronze. Then Rio, they won 6, 2, and 1. Then David Brailsford took over attacking the Tour de France. He won 5 out of 6 Tour de France. He's a complete devotee of this notion of the theory of marginal gains. You break down, in his case, cycling into every single constituent element, and you improve it by 1%, 1%, 1%. They looked at everything that went into winning the Tour de France. They brought the cyclists beds from hotel to hotel. They had their own personal pillows, and that's what he did. And in many ways, and you know it from cricket, you guys, but also just in life in general, life is a game of inches. Those marginal tiny differences can have gigantic impacts. So I think that this whole diaspora is opening up a sort of a fantastic opportunity for Cricket Ireland, because you're in these places playing these sports where our diaspora are based. Fourth thing I was going to suggest, I think there's an interesting opportunity that Cricket Ireland has the potential to usher in an entirely new Ireland-India relationship. Now, I've always been fascinated by India because of my interest in diaspora. The Indian diaspora is extraordinary. There's about 30 million Indian-born people live outside of India. And up until 2002, there was basically no relationship with India. Well, there was a relationship, and it was a bad relationship. India didn't like the diaspora, and the diaspora didn't like India. In that year, Manmohan Singh, the foreign minister, introduced a high-level commission of the Indian diaspora. They toured the world. They spent 2 years listening to the Indian diaspora, who told them that you need to bring about some serious changes if you want us to be engaged. And they wrote a report. It's online. It's 700 pages, the high-level commission of the Indian diaspora. And the Indian government, the Vajpayee government in those days, took on those changes and fundamentally altered the relationship with the diaspora. They introduced a new passport, an overseas citizen of India. They set up a ministry. They have an annual event called the Bharatiya Pravasi Diva in January of every year, where 3,000 Indian CEOs from around the world come back to India. Indians are now the highest paid, most successful ethnic group in the history of the United States. 2/3 of them have university degrees, which is 3 times the regular American average. We have now Indians born and educated who are running companies like Google and Microsoft. And there was an Indian woman who ran Pepsi until recently. But here's what's interesting. Indra Nooyi was that woman. She was born in India. She went to America for her PhD. She joined Bain and then joined a client company, Pepsi, worked her way up, was head of Pepsi. Fascinating. But here's what's more interesting. She was head of the US-India Business Council. Mukhtar Kent, who was the head of Coca-Cola, was head of the US-Turkey Business Council. Andrew Liveris, head of Dow Chemicals, he became head of the US-Greek Business Council. Craig Barrett, head of Intel, who are so huge in Ireland, he became head of the Irish Technology Leadership Group in Silicon Valley. So I think it's fascinating the opportunities that cricket now gives us to build this relationship with India. And I'm delighted that Sanjeev Jasupura has agreed to join the advisory committee, because Sanjeev, he heads up one of the great Indian diaspora organizations in the United States called Diaspora. I think it's great that he's showing an interest. And I think there's a really interesting vista opening up through cricket for Ireland and India to develop very strong relationships. And finally, fifthly, I think all of this ties in neatly with what the government have been saying here. I mean, former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar talked about Ireland being a small country at the center of the world. And Ireland's in the process of doubling our diplomatic footprint, of opening embassies and consulates all around the world in all sorts of different places. For example, we have an embassy now for the first time ever in New Zealand, a great cricketing nation, great sporting nation indeed, which I think is absolutely terrific. Because what we're talking about now here is soft power. I've always been fascinated by soft power. Soft power. There was a book written by an American Harvard professor, Joseph Nye, called Soft Power. And he said soft power is the ability of a country to get what it wants through attraction rather than coercion. So, you know, it's a fascinating notion because we don't have a whole lot of hard power in Ireland. I don't think Ireland's planning on invading anybody anytime soon. I think the last time we had a battle of sorts was back in Clontarf in 1014, and I'm not sure if that was the last time we had a home win. So soft power, this notion of co-opting rather than coercing, I think is fascinating. And sport is the ultimate kind of soft power. Just think of the reputation New Zealand has garnered over a century through its rugby. So I think that there's another opportunity that cricket becomes sort of a part of that. And having worked for over 20 years with Tony O'Reilly and seen the way he used sport, I think it's absolutely fascinating. So, you know, in closing, I'd say I think that now for Cricket Ireland, I think we are going to exit from this. I think the interesting thing is that you look at the global sponsors and the sponsors you've got on this call today. You got one of the world's largest sports management agencies. You got one of the biggest airlines in the world that are engaged with you. You've got a leading data science provider. You've got Ireland's largest sportswear company. You've got a global currency company. You've got a global professional services company involved. You've got one of the fastest growing online recruitment companies in the world engaged with Cricket Ireland. You have an extraordinary range of small to medium sized Irish enterprises. You've got CEOs, CFOs, CTOs. You know, it's all there, Warren and Dennis, the jigsaw. You know, you've got the pieces of the jigsaw. I guess my final words would be, you know, be like, you know, the great sports promotion company in the world, Nike, you know, just do it. So hats off to you, congratulations, and I'll hand you back to Dennis.